For the year 2020, I'm making a video review for every new movie I watch, whether in theaters or at home, and on July 24th, I watched Valley Girl. And no, not the one with Nicolas Cage, I wish. Welcome to my year in movies. This is Talking to Myself. Girls, we've all been there. We have a sucky night at a party that we didn't tell our parents we were going to. And then when we get home and try to stomp upstairs, our mom stops us and asks us what went wrong. And we bare our hearts and souls to our moms. She says, remember the 80s? The decade of excess and the go-go's? And we literally drop a needle and are transported back to the valley. 1980... Thus is the premise of the 2020 motion picture Valley Girl. A jukebox musical that has kind of a West Side Story-esque star-crossed lovers with way lower stakes, where you have Julie from the valley and Randy from Hollywood. And gosh darn it, their friends just don't like that they're going out, but their worlds are so different. Can they make it work? Do we care? So when the film opens, and in the opening credits we see Logan Paul, I know that this is going to be a very promising motion picture, and that this is going to transcend quality to the point where we don't even need to talk about how good or bad it is, except I'm going to talk a lot about how bad it is. And the cast list kept rolling, and I was like, why is Mae Whitman still playing teenagers? Come to think of it, why are Chloe Bennett and Jessica Roth also playing teenagers? They're in their early 30s. The casting is as bad as Grease in that regard, and I say that as a deep Grease apologist. And I love Grease. I love Grease dearly. I understand that those are all grown-ups playing teenagers. But in this movie, it was just very distracting. Because there are films that do the whole adults playing teenagers, and they really lean into that. But here they just kind of didn't, and so everyone's just in their early 30s, I guess. And seeing how the Grease comparison is bugging me too, because at least in Grease, that's like the 50s through the lens of the 70s, and so we get kind of a new perspective on everything that happened then, and it's kind of a playful, sarcastic look at all of that. And so with this being like the 80s through the lens of the 20-teens ostensibly, and it just doesn't compare. But that's a much longer rant that I'm not going to get into. Actually, I am going to get into it. Okay, so with Grease... So a lot of how I feel about this movie can actually be summed up with the movie doesn't care and neither do I. Because the film does not do a great job of making these characters I can care about. I don't care about the relationship between Julie and Randy, but I definitely care more about that relationship than the relationship between Julie and Mickey, her boyfriend, played by Logan Paul. The hidden genius of casting Logan Paul as an 80s movie bully is actually... that is kind of brilliant, because he perfectly embodies like the preppy jock boyfriend from all of those movies, and I feel exactly the kind of revulsion I'm supposed to feel with those like petty asshole bullies from all of those 80s movies. The only problem is Logan Paul lacks every ounce of charisma that James Spader had. And God bless Judy Greer for having to pretend she was a housewife horny for Logan Paul. I don't think any of us has ever been there. But the whole film is so paint by numbers. You have a wealth of 80s tropes that you're pulling from, and you're very self-aware with the fact that this is the 80s decade. I mean, if you're going to throw in a joke about investing in Commodore over Macintosh, you know. And if you're going to put your characters in like bright spandex workout gear and leg warmers, you had a vibe you were going for. There has been media that has critiqued the decade of the 80s. Stranger Things kind of started out that way, but in my opinion, it's kind of like backed off the whole critiquing the 80s thing. And I'm not saying everything that is everything has to like lean into critiquing its predecessor, but I think it kind of sets the stage for doing that, because it has elements of like girls choosing for themselves, or girls being career women on their own and being independent. And if you're going to do that, you have a message you want to send. Don't back off from that. And I'm very curious if the director had a more like critical lens that she wanted to look at the decade with, and she was just told no, because it's a very weak film. The conflicts are very passive and resolved with almost no effort at all. And there were several resolutions that I was like, was this a problem? Was this a problem? For example, at the end of the movie, Julie gives her mom like a French dictionary so she can like pursue French again. I guess that was a problem her mom was experiencing. I guess Randy's gonna go to New York with Julie and his band, and they're gonna be happy. I don't know. It's very paint by numbers. The conflicts aren't deep, and they had her parents be like super chill about everything, but then they fall under the spell of like punk rock is evil, which no. What I wanted was not what the film was out to be, because I definitely thought it would have been cool for the movie to be like a critique of the 80s. You know, there are lots of scenes that were just thrown into movies in that decade that are really sketchy by today's standards, and you could have leaned into that and explored it. Like all of those parties where people get drugged and assaulted, like those were there, and it wasn't right at the time, but everyone was just doing copious amounts of cocaine to really care about it. Now we've come to our senses, you know, we do Xanax instead, and I think you could have looked into that. You could have explored that to some degree. There's a subtle way to do the decade. I know that when I first started watching Stranger Things, I thought it wasn't 80s enough. Like, I thought the way Nancy looked wasn't 80s enough, and that's kind of how I felt with this one. And I'm not saying it has to look like Cyndi Lauper, Boy George, and a flock of seagulls threw up all over it. But if there are moments where I'm beginning to ask, is this how the 80s looked? Or is this what we think the 80s looked like? And if I'm starting to wonder if it looks more like an 80s themed episode of Glee, that's not a question you want me asking when watching your movie, because that takes me out of it. Again, it doesn't have to look super corny, super 80s extravaganza. I'm not asking you to look like Pete Burns, but I don't know. I just wanted more of it. The 80s were the decade of excess. You had an opportunity to do that. I mean, and again, to cite the spandex and leg warmers, you know what 80s excess looks like. Why are you using it sparingly? I will say, to the film's credit, it does have a bangin' soundtrack, and any mediocre jukebox musical is going to have a bangin' soundtrack. They had a remix of Tainted Love, Material Girl, and another song, I forget, but they like worked out to that, and that was a smart decision. I am a fan of that. Is the whole movie worth the experience of a mixtape? No. But here's what I do think this movie will be good for down the road. I think this is a new, like, slumber party classic. Do kids still have slumber parties? Is there a new definition of the word that ruins that question? Please don't ruin this for me. I really think that this film could be fun watching with friends, to, like, throw popcorn at the screen so you can vacuum it up later, and just, like, kind of groan at some of the cringe. And at the same time, it's not cringy enough to become, like, something you lampoon. It's not so bad it's unwatchable. It's just very innocuous and kind of lame. Goodness, if I have to hear another like badass character introduce themselves with bad reputation by Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, I will tear out my eardrums. Stop doing that. Was this film worth watching? For free, yes. It's mostly harmless. I'm never watching it again. If you want something that you literally do not have to focus on ever, and if you want something that you literally do not have to pay attention to, this is the film for that. It is so easy to turn on, tune out, and just hang out. Do cocaine. I don't advocate for the use of it. But it's just, you know, it's whatever. I was disappointed in it, but I also didn't have high expectations for it, which is not a good combination, I have to say. It needed to be campier. It so needed to be campier. Oh my gosh. Again, not to say that it needed to look like Madonna threw up all over it, but it needed to look like the 80s. Please. So yeah, that was Valley Girl. I guess there's a version with Nicolas Cage. I'm kind of interested in what that's all about, so I may check that out next, who knows. But yeah, this has been My Year in Movies. Thank you for watching.